Okay, so here is Joshua chapter 10. So I'm just going to read this for you. Now it came about when Adonizedek, the king of Jerusalem, heard that Joshua had captured Ai and had utterly destroyed it, just as he had done to Jericho and its king, so he had done to Ai and its king, and that the inhabitants of Gibeon had made peace with Israel and were within their land, that he feared greatly, because Gibeon was a great city, like one of the royal cities, and because it was greater than Ai, and all of its men were mighty. Therefore, Adonizedek, the king of Jerusalem, sent word to Hoham, the king of Hebron, and Piram, the king of Yarmut, and to Japhia, the king of Lachish, and to Debir, the king of Eglon, saying, Come up to me and help me, and let us attack Gibeon, for it has made peace with Joshua and with the sons of Israel. So the 5 kings of the Amorites, the king of Jerusalem, the king of Hebron, the king of Yarmut, and the king of Lachish, and the king of Eglon, gathered together and went up. They, with all of their armies, encamped by Gibeon and fought against it. Then the men of Gibeon sent word to Joshua to the camp at Gilgal, saying, Do not abandon your servants. Come up to us quickly and save us and help us, for all the kings of the Amorites that live in the hill country have assembled against us. So Joshua went up from Gilgal, he and all the people of war with him, and all the valiant warriors. And Yahweh said to Joshua, Do not fear them, for I have given them into your hands. Not one of them shall stand before you. So Joshua came upon them suddenly by marching all night from Gilgal. And Yahweh confounded them before Israel, and he slew them with a great slaughter at Gibeon, and pursued them by the way of the ascent of Beth-horon, and struck them as far as Azekah and Makkedah. As they fled from before Israel, while they were at the descent of Beth-horon, Yahweh threw large stones from heaven on them as far as Azekah, and they died. There were more who died from the hailstones than those whom the sons of Israel killed with the sword. Then Joshua spoke to Yahweh in the day when Yahweh delivered up the Amorites before the sons of Israel, and he said in the sight of Israel, O sons, stand still at Gibeon, and O moon in the valley of Ayalon. So the sun stood still, and the moon stopped, until the nation avenged themselves upon their enemies. Is it not written in the book of Yashar? And the sun stopped in the middle of the sky and did not hasten to go down for about a whole day. There was no day like that before it or after it when Yahweh listened to the voice of a man, for Yahweh fought for Israel. Then Yehoshua and all Israel with him returned to the camp at Gilgal. Now these 5 kings had fled and hidden themselves in the cave of Makkedah. It was told Joshua, saying, The 5 kings have been found hidden in the cave of Makkedah. And Yehoshua said, Roll large stones against the mouth of the cave, and assign men by it to guard them. But do not stay there yourselves. Pursue your enemies and attack them in the rear. Do not allow them to enter their cities, for Yahweh, your Elohim, has delivered them into your hand. It came about when Joshua and the sons of Israel had finished slaying them with a very great slaughter until they were destroyed, and the survivors who remained of them had entered the fortified cities, that all the people returned to the camp to Yehoshua at Makkedah in peace. No one uttered a word against the sons of Israel. Then Yehoshua said, Open the mouth of the cave and bring these 5 kings out to me from the cave. They did so, and brought these 5 kings out to him from the cave. The king of Jerusalem, the king of Hebron, the king of Yarmut, the king of Lachish, and the king of Eglon. When they had brought these kings out to Joshua, Joshua called for all the men of Israel, and said to the chiefs of the men of war who had gone with him, Come near, put your feet on the necks of these kings. So they came near and put their feet on their necks. And Joshua said to them, Do not fear or be dismayed. Be strong and courageous. For thus Yahweh will do to all your enemies with whom you are fighting. So afterwards Joshua struck them and put them to death, and he hanged them on 5 trees. And they hung on the trees until evening. It came about at sunset that Joshua gave a command, and they took them down from the trees and threw them into the cave where they had hidden themselves, and put large stones over the mouth of the cave to this very day. Now Joshua captured Makkedah on that day and struck it and its king with the edge of the sword. He utterly destroyed it and every person who was in it. He left no survivor. Thus he did to the king of Makkedah, just as he had done to the king of Jericho. Then Joshua and all Israel with him passed on from Makkedah to Libnah and fought against Libnah. And Yehovah gave it also with its king into the hands of Israel, and he struck it and every person who was in it with the edge of the sword. He left no survivor in it. Thus he did to its king just as he had done to the king of Jericho. And Joshua and all Israel with him passed on from Libnah to Lachish, and they camped by it and fought against it. And Yehovah gave Lachish into the hands of Israel, and he captured it on the second day and struck it and every person who was in it with the edge of the sword, according to all that he had done to Libnah. Then Horam, the king of Gezer, came to help Lachish, and Joshua defeated him and his people until he left no survivor. And Joshua and all Israel with him passed on from Lachish to Eglon, and they camped by it and fought against it. They captured it on that day and struck it with the edge of the sword. And he utterly destroyed that day every person who was in it, according to all that he had done to Lachish. Then Joshua and all Israel with him went up from Eglon to Hebron, and they fought against it. They captured it and struck it and its king and all its cities and all the people who were in it with the edge of the sword. He left no survivor, according to all that he had done to Eglon. And he utterly destroyed it and every person who was in it. Then Joshua and all Israel with him returned to Debir, and they fought against it. He captured it and its king and all its cities, and they struck them with the edge of the sword and utterly destroyed every person who was in it. He left no survivor. Just as he had done to Hebron, so he did to Debir and its king, as he had done to Libnah and its king. Thus Joshua struck all the land, the hill country, and the Negev, and the lowland, and the slopes, and all of their kings. He left no survivor, but he utterly destroyed all who breathed, just as Yehovah, the God of Israel, had commanded. Joshua struck them from Kadesh Barnea, even as far as Gaza, and all the country of Goshen, even as far as Gibeon. Joshua captured all these kings and their lands at one time, because Yehovah, the God of Israel, fought for Israel. So Joshua and all Israel with him returned to the camp at Gilgal. That is it, ladies and gentlemen.
Violence.
Yes, massive violence. Isn't that something?
Things have changed.
Yes.
Not necessarily.
Well, that's a great question. You know, Jimbo says, "Well, I'm so glad things have changed." Well, yes, they certainly have, but I have a feeling they're going to change back. You know, when you look at the book of the Revelation, you can see a lot of that kind of stuff happening again. So, we'll make a couple of those connections. But I want to ask first if anyone here or online, as I am wont to do occasionally, is ask you, what did you see in this passage that you think just caught your attention? Something spiritually or just interestingly?
Did it say I don't know if I have the same translation, the book of Jasher?
Mm-hmm.
So it was referring to that. Is that what it only is in the Catholic Bible, or?
That's a great question. John was intrigued that this is one of the references to the book of Jasher. I pronounced it slightly weird with a Y, Yashar, but yes, it is a reference to the book of Jasher. Now, everybody is always questioning, well, that's kind of weird. Where's that in our Bible? Well, it's not there anymore. No, that's obviously a hotly debated issue. It was in your Bibles until about 500 years ago. I believe it was the Bible Society of England pulled those books out of your Bible about 500 years ago. But from the time before Yeshua, when they were putting together the Hebrew Bible, all 13 of those books in the intertestamental period were in there. Tobit and all of these other books were only pulled out 500 years ago. Now, as to whether they are inspired scripture or whether they are helpful or useful, you'll have to determine that for yourself. As Carla's saying, she's got a copy of her Bible has those things. Her Bible has the Apocrypha in it. Now, you know, there's also, you look at books that are really popular like Enoch and Jasher. It's, we don't have any ancient extant, meaning still existing ancient copies of either of those books. As far as, in the Dead Sea Scrolls, when they found the Dead Sea Scrolls, they did find the book of Enoch, but only chapter 1. Only chapter 1. And so if you go to Amazon or Barnes & Noble or wherever you buy books and you buy the book of Jasher, it's multiple chapters long. Is that authentic? Nobody knows. They only know that that book that you can buy at the bookstore is got the same data in chapter 1 as has been found in the Dead Sea Scrolls, but all of that other stuff, nobody knows whether that is authentic or not. As far as the book of Jasher is concerned, that book is hotly debated. And I don't know what we have, what is called the book of Jasher today. Nobody knows where that came from. It has been around for a long time, but we don't have any ancient copies from the 1st century, 3rd century, 4th century. I think the earliest copy we have is only like 800 or 900 years old. So we don't actually know.
That's why people question it.
That's why people question it, and I totally understand that. Carla?
I had heard once, well, maybe from a couple different people that study that kind of stuff, that the scroll of Yasher is actually a compilation of writings of history from a number of different righteous people. Because the scroll of Yasher refers to righteousness.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. That's what Yeshara means, the book of the upright. So that's a great observation, Carla. And I have read good chunks of the book of Jasher, and I think it's fascinating. It's got a lot of, you can listen, same with the book of Jubilees. It's got a lot of the similar information that you would find in the book of Genesis, but with additional details. Some of them fantastic. Just crazy, yes.
A little bit off that, but part of Psalms were thrown away as well, correct? 10 Psalms. Was that by the same same jury as the English you were talking about 500 years ago, or is that a different date?
I cannot comment on that as I don't know. It's a great question, but I am
But
not.
some of the Psalms are
Yes, I am aware that some of the Psalms.
missing in the modern Bibles.
Yeah, there were some Psalms that were included in some other translations that are not commonly available today, but I cannot
But
speak.
found in the Dead Sea Scrolls.
Right. So I can't comment on that definitively because I haven't done a lot of research on it.
Did you know that, Jim?
No? Okay. So any other? Yes, Garrett, go ahead.
Yeah, so just regarding the book of Enoch and if it was accurate or not, a lot of these books can correlate to other stories. So what we just read was about God. In my book it says Yahweh's wrath. And in Ezekiel, he says the same thing as far as you are against me, I will unsheath my sword and get rid of the upright and the wicked alike. So as far as referencing, I think that's probably going to be the strongest point, because if there is something that doesn't quite make sense or is super out there without necessarily referencing what we know to be true or that we have concrete evidence of that was written, I think we could probably just throw that out. But if it correlates with the rest of the stories, makes sense as far as just common sense, because I think this is a big book of common sense,
Sure.
then it could be canon, but just take it with a grain of salt. I wouldn't bet your life savings on it.
I think that's a great insight, and I agree with you very much that all of these books that are the intertestamental books have fascinating insights, and they're certainly full of wisdom and good insights. As to whether they are, you could say, thus saith Yehovah, perhaps not in certain instances, but that doesn't mean that the Spirit of Yehovah has not infused some of these writings with good wisdom and good insight.
What stands out to me is the calling of, it said all the men were mighty.
Yes.
So I think that there's a key to unlocking the Old Testament. As Christians, it doesn't mean much to us to watch all of this death and carnage because we know God and we trust God and we think, well, if he did that, it must be okay. But for new believers, looking at this, it's like, what? They go in and they kill the whole town? Why are they going through killing everybody?
Absolutely.
What's the deal with this? But I feel that...
You're going to Nephilim, aren't you?
Exactly. So, they're not people. They're not people. So they called them almighty. That's what stood out to me.
I understand, and I knew that it would. And that is an excellent insight. I don't know if you could hear that. If you could not, he was talking about, it says that all of them were mighty men. However, the reference was to both Israel and the men of Gibeon were mighty men. However, the men of Gibeon were grafted into Israel. So it would be a little unusual if these are Nephilim who got grafted into Israel.
Well, that's one of the questions, too, of David's warriors, right?
Yes.
People believe that some of David's
True.
warriors were Nephilim.
And I think, yes, men of renown is definitely that's how you can translate Nephilim. As to what that means exactly, it's obviously hotly debated, but good observation. Good observation. Who else was?
Real quick, there's just no way that Nephilim could work for God because their spiritual father is demonic. They don't have a human spirit, so there's no way those guys are going to work with David.
True enough. Larry?
Yeah, so Joshua was considered a warrior,
Yes.
the leading warrior.
The leader of God's army, absolutely. Yeah, good insight. Gracie?
I don't know if this is the wrong time to say this, but I've always, since I was a kid, been pretty impressed with the sun standing still. And when the scientists today look back in their computers and all that stuff that they can look through, you can see where the time is missing. And along with the king later on who asked, and the Lord added to his
Hezekiah, yes, it turned the sundial back a little bit. Yes, absolutely. That's a key consideration for a lot of people who read this about the sun not going down for a day. I mean, scholars...
Those enemies of the children of Israel were impressed by their war abilities and everything. What about them, like, they were looking forward to the end of the day so that they could take a break, and it didn't come.
That's right. Well, and I think that's a great insight, Gracie, and we'll deal with that a little bit in deeper detail here in just a moment. But Gracie was talking about the impressive nature of the sun not going down, for an extra period of time. Scholars twist themselves into knots trying to figure out what that means. Who knows? Yes, scientifically, I talked about that with the kids, and the kids said, well, man, dude, if God stopped the Earth's rotation, that would kind of throw some things off. I'm like, I'm sure it would.
It's probably scientifically impossible. It makes
Scientifically impossible.
ask the question, what does it mean for the Hebrew cosmology?
Yeah.
Because it does not say that the Earth did not spin.
That's true. So
the sun
what?
says that the moon did not move.
Yeah, what does that mean? Nobody knows. Keith, however, does know, and he's going to tell us.
I got a question. I just want to say I was pretty impressed that I think this is the first place in verse 11 where they call in an airstrike.
Yes, they do.
And those huge pieces of hail come down, and that's even in Revelation. I think they talk about that there will be hail.
And we're going to
Look
Excellent.
forward to that again. I mean,
Absolutely.
this is gonna be another airstrike.
And we're gonna talk about that a little bit more here in just a moment. But yeah, those are great observation, and we can always count on Keith, our resident cosmologist, to talk about the signs in the sun and the heavens and the moon. He's our resident astronomer.
Well, hey, to point that out, it talks about the moon being in one valley and the sun in the other. So, and during the day, most people don't look up, but the moon is quite visible during the day.
Yeah.
Especially when it's in its larger phases.
Yeah, absolutely.
So they saw the sun over one side, and depending on where it was in the sky before Yehovah stopped the sun's movement, and then the moon stopped too, they could have been, about each halfway in the middle of the sky.
Yep.
Separated at least 90 degrees to 100 degrees from each other. So
Yeah. So as to what that is, what that means, I have no idea. Something clearly happened. It was miraculous, no question about it.
What a mighty God.
Yeah, and I think I'll drop this little nugget out there for your consideration, and I think this is probably one of the biggest issues that I think is being brought up here, and that is that remember who is the God of these people that are being destroyed here. Their most common god is Baal, and he is the storm god, the god of the sky. Okay, so he's the god of the waters and the god of rain and snow and thunder and lightning. What's interesting here is all of those elements were just used against these people who worship that God who is supposed to control all these things. So this is eerily reminiscent of what we had with the Exodus in Egypt, where God is destroying the gods of Egypt. He is demonstrating to these people in the land, your God is not God.
Or maybe the principality was being unseated. There was a spiritual battle happening.
And that is a delightful comment, Nathan, that principalities perhaps are being unseated as there's a spiritual battle going on. I think that's a fascinating insight. Jimbo?
I like the fact that the Gibeonites are Gentiles that tricked Israel into not destroying them and making a covenant with them.
Yeah.
And they're like, we're in trouble. I know we're nothing but trouble, but we're really in trouble. And then Israel didn't go like, it's time for you to get what you deserve.
Absolutely.
Israel came through, and it just worked out great.
It did.
Awesome.
You know, the last time we were together, and that's one of the first points that I have in my notes here. The last time that we were together, we talked about the Gibeonites being tricky and kind of,
moldy bread.
Yeah, moldy bread and worn out shoes.
They live on the other side of the next mountain.
Exactly. So, the interesting thing here is, and I'll just throw this out here. If you notice in verse, I believe it's in verse 2, at the end of verse 2, I'm just going to open up my electronic Bible here. If you look at, it's at the end of verse 1. I didn't notice this, and this is why I will remind you again that you should always read your Bible in multiple translations. Because when I read this originally in the Darby translation, at the end of verse 1, it says, and that the inhabitants of Gibeon had made peace with Israel and were among them. I switched it to the concordant literal translation, and it said, made peace with Israel and are in their midst. Okay, now where have we heard that phrase just a couple of chapters ago? That is the same Hebrew word where Rahab was brought out of Jericho, and it says when they rescued them from Jericho, they set them outside the camp. But then just 2 verses later, it says, and they have lived in the midst of Israel to this day. This actually says in the text that the Gibeonites are living in the midst of Israel, which is clearly they're not if they're in the city of Gibeon, and Joshua and the men of Israel and the whole Israel is over at Gilgal, but the text uses that same term. And we kind of struggled last time with are these good guys or bad guys? These people who are tricksters trying to ingratiate themselves into Israel. But we also noted that the next time that we hear about the Gibeonites, they are actually returning to the city of Jerusalem with Ezra and Nehemiah to rebuild the temple.
There might be more than meets the eye.
There's definitely more than meets the eye with these Gibeonites, for sure. I do believe that they are getting grafted in, and they, the other thing is that they're calling out. They're calling out for salvation.
Yes.
This reminds me, that anyone who calls upon the name of the Lord will be saved. They say, do not let your hands slack. Come and rescue us. Mm-hmm. And they do. So this is a very interesting passage. Who had their hand up? Is it somebody online? Oh, Garrett, go for it, buddy.
What I thought was really interesting was Joshua 10:14.
Garrett, before you continue, hold on just a second, buddy. Let me ask you a question. Is there any possibility of you turning yourself up? Do you have any volume on that thing? That's better. Yes, that's better. Thank you.
You're welcome. What I thought was interesting was Joshua 10:14. I will read as my Bible says. There was never a day like that before or since when Yahweh obeyed the voice of a man, for Yahweh was fighting for Israel. And I think it's good to point out that one of his titles is Saboeth or Sabaoth.
Mm-hmm.
What that is hosts, or I'm sure you guys know, but the hosts of armies. So a lot of it can be related to the God of the armies on earth, in the stars, or even the unseen armies. So, for me thinking, the relationship between the Israelites and Yahweh was so strong that he actually took their orders instead of the other way around, because he is supposed to be our leader as far as leading the charge, but he fought for his people, which I think is actually really
excellent insight. I'll tell you a funny story real quick. I was filming a video one day with a client, and there was a woman who had she had a sad story, but she had a tattoo on her arm right here, and it was in Hebrew. And I was talking with her, and I said, "Oh, look, you got a tattoo. You got a Hebrew tattoo." She's like, "Yeah." I said, "Oh, yeah, that's pretty awesome. I know a little bit about Hebrew. I study the Bible and such." And she said, "Really?"
It says don't get a tattoo.
Enough to know that it says don't get a tattoo. Yes, but she says, "Really? Can you read it?" I said, "Well, let me see." And I said, "It says, oh yeah, it says Yuva Sevaot." And she began to cry. She said, "I've never had anyone read that before." I'm assuming she knew what it meant. She says it means the Lord of hosts. I said, "Yeah, I know that. That is pretty sweet." But she was, apparently it touched her heart because it meant something to her, but no one had ever been able to read it. I thought it was kind of interesting. But yeah, so that was a good observation, Garrett. Thank you. Now, I want to bring your attention to Michael because he wants to say something.
Oh, I was just going to point out, it was interesting, too, that it also repeats, do not be afraid. Well, this isn't just the English Standard. Do not be afraid or dismayed, be strong and courageous, because that just keeps repeating over and over again.
No.
We have heard that like 10 times between the end of the book of Deuteronomy and the beginning of the book of Joshua, and it's still appearing here in chapter 10, which is almost halfway through the book. They just keep repeating, do not be afraid. And I will call your attention to that Hebrew word for fear, which I believe is yara, and the first time that it was mentioned in Genesis chapter 3, where it says that Adam was naked and became afraid. And you know that the rule of first mention will always draw your attention to something significant about the root and nature of fear, which is nakedness, spiritual nakedness. So consider that. But I was going to say, in regards to chapter 10, verses 1 and 2, I'll just make a couple of observations. You notice that the names of these people, if you look at the names of these kings who are being mentioned here, you've got Adonai-Zedek. Does anyone know what that means?
Well, Lord.
Adonai is Lord, and Zedek is righteous. Yeah. Now, so this is Melchizedek is the king of righteousness. So, are these two guys related? They're from the same place. He's from Jerusalem. It says that it's the king of Jerusalem, Adonai-Zedek.
Oh my goodness!
Now, you cannot possibly be thinking to yourself, "Well, this must be Shem." Well, Shem's not going to fight against Israel, but why would they? Is this a carryover from Melchizedek?
And since Melchizedek had no parents, he was timeless. Here we have Adonai-Zedek, who's dealing with time, making the sun stand still, messing with time. And
No, God made the sun stand still.
I know, but Melchizedek had no father or mother, right?
Right. Well, according to the book of Hebrews, it just says it doesn't give his lineage.
Right. He has no lineage, and so he's a timeless figure.
Sure.
And here's maybe his brother also having an effect on time, having power over time.
Well, that's what I'm asking you about. How do you get it?
Been alive at this point.
No, I don't think so. But how are you connecting this guy having an effect on it? It doesn't say he stopped time. It says Joshua spoke to God and God stopped time.
Okay, what was Adonai-Zedek's role in the story?
He is one of the kings who was fighting against Joshua.
Oh, gosh.
Yeah, he's the king of Jerusalem who was fighting. He's the guy who instigated this whole thing and gathered up all of his allies to fight against Joshua. This is what's interesting is
His name is the Lord of Righteousness.
the Lord of Righteousness is a bad guy.
That's like Laban.
It is. And if you look at the names of all of these kings, none of them are bad. They all have names that have good connotations, which is very unusual because or at least you hope that when you read something in your Bible about some evil confederacy of kings, trying to overthrow the Lord, that they will be named, my father is the devil, or, I'm Lord of Thunder, or, something stupid, But no, these people are all named after righteousness and straight paths, and it's like, what? This is a little bit weird.
How did that
Yeah, how did that happen? That's a great question. And I think that you want to look at something interesting. These are people who have a name that they are righteous, but they are not. Where have you heard that before?
Like self-righteousness?
Possibly. Where have you heard that before? They have a name that is righteous. Now, I want to throw another couple of considerations there to look into. Notice that these are all Amorites. What does Amorite mean? The talkers. These kings hide out in the cave of Makkedah. What does Makkedah mean? The cave of the shepherds. So we've got these talkers who are hiding in the cave of the shepherds, who are all named with righteous names, but they are not righteous, and they are being destroyed by Yehoshua. Have you heard anything like this before?
Bad shepherds.
The bad shepherds.
It's a little close to home.
It's a little close to home, isn't it? What does that remind you of? That reminds me of Joshua. Benny Hinn, stop it. That's terrible. I don't know. He's out there casting lightning bolts around or something. But this reminds me of the wicked shepherds who Yeshua talked about. It also talks about, it reminds me of the letter to the church at Sardis. He says, you have a name, but it ain't so. This to me is sobering. If this book of Joshua is a prophetic shadow picture of the return of Yeshua, and these righteous kings who are shepherds, who are talkers, are being destroyed by Joshua, and God himself is getting involved in the destruction, playing an active role, this is an interesting and challenging concept. Also note something here. I don't know if any of you picked this up, but it says, right when this conflict starts, that God discomfited them and that he dropped hailstones on them. And a whole slew of them died and there was a great destruction. But then what happens? The story keeps going on. It's like they're running away. Well, how are they running away? I thought they were all dead. And then all of a sudden, we chase them down. Don't let any of them enter their cities. They had a great slaughter, but some of them made it to their cities. Then after that, we're fighting against these cities, and there's another great slaughter. It's like, how many times are we having a great slaughter here? When are these enemies finally defeated? What does this say to you?
But it also keeps saying there were no survivors.
It also keeps suggesting in the Hebrew that there were no survivors. But yet, are they respawning? I mean, that's like a video game. I know. There's like these enemies are respawning. Level 20 enemies are respawning. But seriously, what does that suggest to you if these unrighteous kings who are talkers and are hiding in the cave of the shepherds and that they're being destroyed by Yeshua and you just can't seem to defeat them? To me, this is a bigger picture kind of thing, which is talking about these enemies of yours will never go away. You're gonna not until Yuvah puts an end to them. And we know that even when the kingdom is established, according to most people's readings of the book of the Revelation, we've got Yeshua arriving and having a great defeat of his enemies and establishing his kingdom. But then at the end of this millennial reign, there's another rebellion. And God himself gets involved and there's another great slaughter. It's like the enemies never seem to lie down. And I think that this suggests to us that we need to continue to fight. You cannot grow weary and you cannot be faint, and you must be strong and courageous, and you must never let these talkers, many of whom might pretend to be righteous, overcome you. This is a bigger picture for me in this section, and that's just part one of it. Now, I want to ask Angela to come and join me for just a second, because I want to ask her a couple of things. And one of the things that I wanted to ask her about, which was kind of interesting, was in regards to this confederacy of these 5 kings. Because I think if you've heard anything before in regard to 5 kings, that might sound slightly familiar to you.
Well, I wasn't ready to say that yet.
Okay, that's fine. Can you guys hear her okay?
No, because I whispered.
They could probably hear that. Don't whisper to me because they can probably hear you.
The only thing here was to establish that if you went back to, I think, chapter 9 at the very beginning, it talks about the groups that are forming like an alliance or confederacy against Israel because they see it coming. And so it lists off 6 groups of, I don't know, the
Jebusites and the Amorites,
the ites. It lists off 6 of them, right? And then it talks about, it doesn't say the Gibeonites, it says the Hivites. And so there's a little bit of confusion there. Are the Hivites the Gibeonites, or the Gibeonites what's the relationship there? Because when you get to the beginning of chapter 10, now you have 5 kings. And it doesn't say that they are of those ites. But it makes you wonder, because what happened in between was the Gibeonites decided to ally themselves with Israel. So it's almost like there was this confederacy of the locals against Israel, and the Gibeonites said,
They're bowing out.
We're out of here. We're going to go make friends with the invader and make a covenant with them. So we're kind of saving our skins. And that's what kicks off this battle. That these 5 kings are not coming after the Hebrews. The 5 kings are scared because of what the Gibeonites did. And it says that the Gibeonites, that major city was a, what does it say? A royal
Like
city.
one of the royal cities.
Yeah, and that they had mighty warriors there. And so it's like they're going to all gang up against, it's like the toughest kid on the block was supposed to be on your side, and all of a sudden he's allied with your enemy, so you've got to get everybody together. And so he and I had discussed, and I just wanted to establish this for something I'm going to kind of go over later, was that, yes, the Gibeonites are Hivites, but not all Hivites are Gibeonites. If you look at the next chapter in verse 19, it says, there was not a city that made peace with the children of Israel save the Hivites who dwell in Gibeon. So there's other Hivites, because in these future battles, it's going to talk about Hivites still fighting with Israel. But this is a segment of the Hivites, the Gibeonites, that made peace with Israel. So I just wanted to establish that yes, in that initial list in chapter 9, when it lists off those 6 ites, that there was one of those ites that dropped out. So we start with 6 and then we end up with 5 kings. Not necessarily that those are correlated, but just so you get an idea of kind of these alliances and this confederacy that's going on for something that I'll address later.
Well, hang out for just a moment, because I'm just going to cover one thing, and I'm going to have you. No, you can just leave that there, and I'm going to just cover one thing, and then I'll have you kind of bounce right back to you. The one thing that I wanted to say was, we've got leaving the enemy's camp, as you have suggested, that there might have been a confederacy of 6 people groups who were going to fight against Israel. But that one of them decided, you know what, this confederacy is probably not a good idea. We're bouncing out of here, and we're going to go make an alliance with the Israelites and join them. And then these other 5 nations decided to turn on them. You know, that kind of brings to my mind that when you leave the enemy's camp, you should expect attack. That is one of the most precarious positions to be in, but it's also one of the most promising positions to be in. Because when these Gibeonites flee, they're going to be attacked by their former confederates who are evil, but they're going to be protected by God. So I think that new believers or people who have turned away, have repented or turned back to God or something like that, are certainly vulnerable. That they are vulnerable to attack. And you know how when you're trying to turn to Yehovah, that the enemy just comes out of the woodwork. And all those old friends that you used to hang around and all of those things that used to cause you trouble in your life come right back in, and they're trying to horn their way back in. But I think God has a special hedge of protection around you when you do experience genuine repentance and you're ready to connect with God. He's got that protection for you, so that when you call out, you know, the Gibeonites call out to Joshua for salvation, they're calling out to Jesus for salvation, you know, and he rescues them. But I think that's an interesting insight. And I just wanted to bring to your attention before I kind of bring, and I'll round this back out to Angela. You know, he says that if you look at a literal translation, it says, "Do not let your hand slack. Come and save us." That Hebrew phrase for letting your hand slack, I did not put in my notes what the Hebrew phrase is, but you can look it up. But it's first used in Exodus 4:26, and this is used when Moses had just gotten his call to go to Israel and rescue the children of Israel, and he camps along the way with his wife Keturah, and God is seeking to kill him. Something to do with circumcision. And it says God let his hand slack. He let go of him. He decided not to destroy him. That was a very mysterious passage. But just to draw your attention to some interesting similarities there. I'm not exactly sure what to make of it, but I thought you might want to look into it. But in regards to the enemy and the other group of kings, I'll have Angela talk just for a moment regarding some connections that she sees regarding, Joshua came upon their camp at night and began to destroy them, and then God intervenes and drops hailstones and stuff like that. Angela saw some interesting comparisons between the 5 kings in the book of Genesis, chapter 18, I believe. Is it 14? Where the 4 kings versus the 5 kings, where Abraham has to rescue Lot. She saw some very interesting similarities and differences between these passages, and I'll let her discuss that for just a moment.
I wanted to first say that I don't know what the significance of these things is, or if there is a significance. It's just things that I noticed and wanted to point them out, and maybe at some point in your study that it'll connect and you'll maybe come across the significance, and if you do, share it with me. But when I do these things, when I compare things or pull out details or put things side by side, it's not that I think that there's one meaning and this is it, and I'll fight you on any other thing you want to say about it, because I don't think that these things have one meaning. I think that when David said, one thing has the Lord spoken, 2 things I have heard, I think it's because he says more than one thing with his words. I think it's that it goes deeply. So I wanted to A and B the battle of the 5 kings against the 4 kings that happens in Genesis, and this battle of the 5 kings of the Amorites. And so there were some things where there was a correlation between the two. And the first is that I'm hoping you're familiar with the story of the 5 kings versus the 4 kings in Genesis, when Abraham came and had to rescue Lot. Right. Okay, so in that one, you had an agreement between 4 kings, and they were lorded over 5 kings. It was like they were supposed to pay them homage or whatever. Homage. and they broke that agreement. The 5 decided, we're not going to do that anymore, and so the 4 came to attack them. And so you, in the battle that we just looked at in Joshua, again, you have this alliance among foreigners, not Israelites, but one of them peels away. And so both of these battles were instigated by a break in alliance between foreign parties. But then the Hebrews intervene. In both of them, you have an intercession by a Hebrew or all the Hebrews to intercede for the one or ones that have been joined to them. In the battle of the 5 kings in Genesis, you have Abram at the time interceding for Lot. He wasn't fighting for the 5 kings or for the 4. He wasn't on there. He was interceding to rescue Lot, who was his brother. And you can say, no, it wasn't his brother. He calls him his brother in this part, because I think that term is more than we think. The brother is, brother, sister, that's the only person you call a brother. But I think in other cultures that's not necessarily true. It's like his bro, if you want to kind of look at it that way. And then in the battle we just looked at, the Israelites are interceding on behalf of the Gibeonites who are being attacked. So in both of these, it uses that expression when Abram at the time, takes off to go against those 4 kings, because it was the 4 kings that he that's going to get a little confusing for you. He went after the 4 kings because they're the ones that attacked the 5 and took Lot. So when he goes after them, he takes the trained servants, and that word servants has this connotation of born in his house, 318 of them. He takes them and they divided by night. I don't know why it's worded that way, but it's the impression that they traveled by night to go rescue Lot. And so what he just pointed out was in this one that it specifically mentions that he took his mighty warriors, Joshua, and went up by night. Okay. Keep in mind, it takes him a day to get there. It took him 3 days to make the journey between Gilgal and the Gibeonite city before, when they were, hey, why did you lie to us? Mm-hmm. So he's not just, okay, we'll get there and help you out eventually. He's not doing that. He is rushing to their aid. His hand is not slacking.
His hand is not slack.
All right. In both of these cases, you have the king of Jerusalem. And I don't know how many other places in the Bible you have a reference to a king of Jerusalem, but I know that 2 of them are here.
Well, and also this is, I forgot to put this in my notes, but this is the first reference in the whole Bible of the word Jerusalem.
In the Joshua account.
No, in the whole Bible.
Yes, the reference, when it's mentioned in Genesis, it doesn't say Jerusalem.
No, it's called
it says
Salem. Right.
Yeah. So I don't know if you remember it. We were just talking about Melchizedek, and I was waiting for somebody to put it together. That Melchizedek encounter happens right in smack dab in the middle of the Battle of the 5 Kings. After he brings back Lot, and he's got all the loot, he meets the 5 kings of Sodom on the plain, of the Sodom and its surrounding cities. He meets them on the plain, and then it says Melchizedek comes out with bread and wine, and they do their talk about the tithing. And then he resumes his interaction with the king of Sodom, who says, keep all the stuff. I want the people. Abraham makes a reference to...
Not a shoestring.
Yeah, he says, not a sandal. I won't let you give me a thong of a sandal because I don't want you to think that you're the one who may be rich. So we have Melchizedek and Adonizedek both tied to battles with 5 kings. So at this point, I'm thinking there's just too much similarity here to not try and put these next to each other and figure this out. Also, in both accounts, you have bread, wine, and sandals. The Gibeonites used the bread, their wine bags, and their sandals to deceive in order to form the covenant with the Israelites. And in that small little interaction with Melchizedek, he brings bread and wine, and right after that, he tells the king of Sodom, I won't take a sandal thong from you. So you have those 3 items right in the same neighborhood, which is odd. And then you also have pits and caves, because when the 5 kings were fleeing from the 4 kings, they fell into the tar pits. Somehow got back out and got back at that meeting with Melchizedek. And in the Joshua account, the kings go into the cave and then are taken back out. They didn't stay there and are killed. So my my suspicion is that that they're almost like bookends. That
Is it a menorah pattern?
I don't know.
I just wondered if you
that would be
looked.
huge. But see, you got to think about who's the character in the first Battle of the Five Kings. It's Abram. And do you know what happens right after the Battle of the Five Kings? The covenant of the pieces. Okay, so you have Abraham, the one who was promised the land, the start of the whole thing. And here you have Joshua, the warrior, going in to take the land. He is taking the land. It's the fulfillment of that promise. It's almost like, here's your beginning, and here's a picture of what the end will be like. And I want you to almost menorah pattern those two things. And you'll notice that you have the promise made to Abram, and then at the end, you have this picture of fulfillment, but it's also filled with judgment. It's like the fulfillment of his promise is interlaced with the judgment of those who are against him. And I want you to keep that in mind, this interlacing between the fulfillment of a promise and judgment, because I think we're going to see that again when he lets me do this piece.
And I have just a couple of more details to point out to you, and then I'm going to have Angela talk about this next little part. Notice in verse 10 where it starts talking about the hailstones. This is most curious. Okay, I want to bring your attention to something that we often overlook. The thing that we often overlook is that the Bible starts with the Exodus from Egypt and ends with the return of the Messiah Yeshua.
It starts with that.
It starts with the Exodus from Egypt. That's what throws people off a lot of times. Moses went back and wrote the history of what happened to lead us up to this point in the book of Exodus. So the book of Genesis is like a prologue, if you want to put it that way.
This is how we got here.
This is how we got to where we are now. But remember that the Bible was written by Moses, and so the story begins with the Exodus from Egypt and ends with the return of the Messiah Yeshua at his second coming to establish God's kingdom. Now, what's interesting, the reason I bring that to your attention is it pays to keep that in your mind, that the whole thing starts with the Exodus from Egypt. Except for Jasher. But that there are so many similarities between the Exodus from Egypt and the return of the Messiah Yeshua. There are an incredible amount of similarities between Exodus and Revelation. One of those similarities is hailstones. And this is, you don't see hailstones very often in the Bible. It's quite rare. In fact,
Probably a good thing.
it probably is a good thing. But, a couple of things that I want to bring to your attention. And this is in regards to God seeming to be very much involved in this battle. You know that God gives the Israelites victory in a lot of cases. I mean, he, did all kinds of miracles in Egypt and slaughtered the firstborn and opened up the sea and killed the whole Egyptian army. And that was very aggressive. And he helps Israel against their enemies on a lot of cases. But I don't know why, and I'll ask you if you got this impression too, but when I read this, I just had the feeling that God was very much involved here, more so than usual. Although what he did in Egypt was tremendous, the reading here just made me think that God had almost like an axe to grind, or he had a very... This little battle sequence here was near and dear to his heart. He discomfited these Amorite kings. He drops hailstones on them. He makes the sun stand still for a day. It just seemed to me to be quite aggressive. I'm not sure why I got that impression, but it's just something that occurred to me. But note that when it says that God discomfited them, that's the Hebrew word ham, which basically means to terrify or agitate or alarm. and it's first used in Exodus 14:24, and I just happen to have that here, and it says, and it came to pass in the morning watch that Yehovah looked upon the camp of the Egyptians in the pillar of fire and the cloud, and embarrassed the camp of the Egyptians. The embarrassed is a slightly awkward translation. The concordant literal version says that he discomfited, but if you look at that Hebrew word, it is the Hebrew word hamam, and it is to move noisily, confuse, make discomfort, break, consume, crush, destroy, trouble, vex. So God is causing some type of intense consternation of these Egyptians through the pillar of cloud in Exodus 14:24, which is the first time this word is used, and then he's doing it again here in this section. So that's number one. And then number two is he's very active in this battle, and he's actually bringing in these hailstones, which is the Hebrew word barad eben. Barad is hail and eben is stone. But like I said, these are rare in the Bible. And so when you look at what's happening with these hailstones in the book of Exodus, and then immediately after that in the book of Joshua, where we have them kind of entering the land and fulfilling the promise that God had made to Abraham, then at the very end of the book, you got this reoccurrence of hailstones. It's quite fascinating, and Angela is going to point out a couple of key details about the hailstones that you see in the book of the Revelation, because she found a couple of interesting anomalies in that section. So I'll let her discuss that just for a moment there.
Okay, the thing I want you to think about in what we just looked at in Joshua is that what we've seen is a gathering of kings, armies, nations, and then they are judged with hailstones. And I think that there's a connotation that goes with hailstone of judgment, because the first ones we see are against Sodom after the Abram thing with Melchizedek. So remember that the nations' armies gather, and then hailstones fall on them. And so, if we go to, and I really like. I think Nathan said it earlier. Somebody said something about a war going on, not just on earth, but in the.
The principalities.
Yes. And so I think especially when you look at Revelation, you have to see that what's going on in the spiritual is manifesting itself in the physical, and it's almost like they're just head-on crashing into each other. And so I think a lot of times when you read Revelation, you're a little bit thrown because there's these two realms they're interlacing, okay? And I think that if you look at the 6th and 7th in Revelation, you'll see the same interlacing, and you're going to see how it's related to what we just read in this battle. And Alan asked me, the 6th and 7th what? And I said, the 6th and 7th of everything. So we're going to look at 3 pairs of 6s and 7s. And I'm just going to read these to you. I think you'll pick up on it. Okay, the 6th seal. I'm not going to read you the whole 6th seal. I'm going to read you the part that is interesting given this. In chapter 6, verse 15, it says, "And the kings of the earth, the great men, the commanders, the rich, the strong, every slave, free man, hid themselves in the caves." Okay, we just saw kings hiding themselves in the caves. And what did they say? They said, "Fall on us and hide us from the..." What a terrible request to make, because he's gonna go ahead and do that for them.
Why would they hide and then want to get killed anyway?
I don't know. Okay, so then there's an You guys with me?
Go ahead.
There's an interlude between the 6th and 7th, and then you have the 7th seal, and it says, I'll just describe this one, I won't read it. When the 7th seal is kind of interlaced with the first trumpet, it's almost like the 7th seal kicks off the trumpets, because it describes the trumpets, and then it says the seal is unsealed, And then it says the angel takes fire, throws it to the earth from the altar. And then it says the first trumpet sounded and hailstones fell. So it's almost like the angel in the spiritual takes the fire, and what it looks like when it hits the earth is a hailstone, like the transition there between physical and spiritual. So in the seals, between the 6th and 7th, we see kings in the cave, hailstones falling. Now let's go to trumpets. In the 6th trumpet, a piece of this is the 4 angels at the Euphrates River are released, and then it has a description of the army of the 200 million. Is it 200 million? 200 million. Not the kings of the east yet, no. No, it's the army of the 200 million. Just hold your horses. You're almost right. You're a little bit ahead. Okay, so 6th, very well could be. Okay, so the 6th trumpet, you've got the armies of the army of the 200 million gathering. What do you think the 7th trumpet's going to be?
It's going to bring the thunders in, whatever they are.
Well, that's in the interlude between the 6th and 7th. You've got the thunders and the 2 witnesses.
Okay.
And then when the 7th trumpet does sound, it says, our king has begun to reign. It talks about judgment. The temple opens, the ark appears, and there's a great hailstorm. Okay? The armies gather, another hailstorm. Let's go to the bowls. Okay, in the 6th bowl, again, there's a reference to the Euphrates, just like there was with the 6th trumpet. Very similar, huh? And now we have the way prepared for the
Kings of the East.
kings of the East, and they gathered at Armageddon. Again, we have armies gathering, and then what do you think is going to happen with the 7th bowl?
Hailstones.
The voice comes out of the temple, says, it is done, and 100-pound hailstones come down upon the men. It's like every time you have an army gather, the next thing that happens is the hailstones. And
Real heavy ones.
yeah, those are big ones.
Man, a 500 is bad.
Yeah, one feet deep. How do you resist 100 weight chunk of ice?
Yeah, that's
You get a
absolutely,
free whiff out of that.
absolutely Normally it wouldn't.
Hold on. Yeah.
Normally it wouldn't say 100 pounds, it would just say a hailstone, correct?
Yeah.
There's specified.
I'm reading from my NA.
That's what it says.
NASB.
It says 100 pounds. I don't know what's going on with the Greek there.
Well, it certainly wouldn't have said pounds in the Hebrew. They didn't have to do a unit measurement, but
Did you want
Do
to
I
say
have
another
time
thing?
to?
Yeah. Okay, listen up.
Okay. You know, remember when I was talking about when we compared the battles of the 5 kings? I said it's like bookends, promise, fulfillment. In the interludes between, do you remember what it said the Gibeonites would be?
Hauling water and chopping wood.
Oh,
The
water
wood
carrier.
choppers and the water. Yeah, which is which is curious. I thought it was curious. I don't know.
Water what?
It says that when Joshua allowed them to live, he said, "You guys will chop wood and carry water for the house of my God." And now she has some very interesting.
Well, tenuous, but just
Tenuous, but
think,
interesting.
Think about it. In the interlude between the 6th and 7th trumpet, you had the 2 witnesses, who everyone suspects maybe, like the majority opinion is,
Moses and
It's
Elijah.
Enoch and Elijah, because they
Disagreement.
He's a rebel. He's got to throw in
They
something
never
weird.
died.
Okay. I'm sorry I asked that question. Okay, in
specify, though.
He was resurrected, but he
All right, they're like children.
there's rabbit holes everywhere. You guys are falling into the tar pit.
You guys are falling in the tar pits. No, you're right.
Crawl
There are
back out.
rabbit holes everywhere. Go ahead, Angela.
There is a theory. Well, one of the rabbis, you know, how they get to overthinking things, that Abraham is the wood chopper, because when he was in Jerusalem, which was called Mount Moriah at the time, and he took his son up on Mount Moriah, He chopped the wood to make the altar. Okay? And he's our beginning. He's at this bookend. Or if we're in Hebrew, we'll start over here.
Right.
And that your water drawer is your Elijah, because he judged the gods.
Flood.
Remember when he poured the water on the thing and the fire came down from heaven, which sounds a lot like what we were just reading in Revelation, this judgment coming down. And so again, you have maybe a picture of bookends, of beginning and end, promise, fulfillment. That's all.
And then if you count how many letters are in Abraham.
Now stop it. You are teasing me.
Listen to it. Go into some Hebrew gematria there. Now, if you look at there's some interesting connotations when you look at water carriers and wood choppers. Fascinating stuff in the rabbinic writings. But I'm gonna gather up the hem of my robe here and wrap this up. But I want to go to Lou first.
Well, I wasn't here last time, but just kind of, maybe you went over this. Why did those Gibeonites feel that they had to deceive? I mean, couldn't they have just gone to them and said,
Well, that's a great question, and we did address that slightly. Lou asked, why did these Gibeonites feel like they had to deceive? Why couldn't they just have gone to Joshua and said, we surrender, don't kill us? I think, yeah, we'll do whatever you want. Angela would like to throw in her couple of shekels here.
If, as we were kind of guessing that Gibeonites are a picture of the Gentiles being grafted in, every time you've got this kind of thing happen, there's an identity crisis. Joseph, they think he's Egyptian, and with Yeshua, there's an identity crisis right now about who he is, and so I think that they wouldn't have been fit in the template if there wasn't some kind of identity confusion.
I think that's an interesting idea. I also think that you have to consider that God had explicitly told them, and Moses had instructed them, I believe it was in...
No quarter.
Yeah, there was no quarter to be given. All of these people were to be completely annihilated. And so they were following God's command to destroy these people. And I think that these people knew this. There was obviously that anomaly of Rahab, but that was one person. And she engaged in an act of faith which allowed her to be rescued. But these people didn't have that opportunity. Nonetheless, they do...
Lied, but not to them.
And yes, and they lied, and she lied. When we did talk about these similarities between Rahab the harlot and these Gibeonites, and there were some similarities for sure. But I think that these people were doomed, and they knew it, and the only way they could see out of it was to trick them. But it worked.
Well, then we could be long lost brothers too. I mean, doesn't Jacob mean the tricker?
The deceiver, yeah. That's true. Very true. June.
Oh, but they tricked them, first of all, because they had heard that they had won over Ai, or however you say it.
Mm-hmm.
And they knew that God told them, well, God gave them power over all the enemies and told them wipe them all out.
Mm-hmm.
They knew that because they heard that.
Yeah.
So that's why they tricked them, so that they could make a covenant with them or whatever and live. And because once they made a covenant, that would be between them and God, and it was not to be broken.
That's true. Yeah, I think that they might have known something about the covenant that these people keep with these gods. So that's a serious business in those days.
Israelites must have had a reputation for keeping their covenants.
Which is unusual because you wouldn't think they would have a reputation for keeping their covenants.
People had just
True.
bowed out of one.
Nathan?
And this might be reaching. This is part of the scripture that always kind of annoyed me, being a good little Christian churchman. There's parts of the scripture where God commends people for being tricky.
I mentioned that the last time we were together talking about this, is that this really reminded me of that unscrupulous money manager, that accountant that was in the Gospels. And that, what's that? Tamar. Yeah, Tamar tricking Judah. And yeah, it definitely, Rebecca having Jacob trick the father. I mean, yeah, it's kind of interesting that you sometimes see in the Bible that these tricky people who don't exactly, they try to do the right thing, but in the wrong way. You know what I'm saying?
The master praises the servant who forgives the debts.
Right.
He's stealing from him, basically.
He is. Yes, he is.
And he commends him. He's like, you're smart.
That's fairly smart.
And he's in the position of the father. The
Right.
master is the father in that
Right.
sense. I never liked that, but...
I didn't like it either.
But it is all throughout Scripture.
You're right. You're absolutely right. It's a very unusual thing, but I think God commends prudence and wisdom and sometimes acting with craft. It's a little weird. It's a little weird. June?
Well, they tricked them too because, hang on, I can't see. I can read my own notes. I had it. It goes in there and I'll get it real fast. They tricked them. No, I don't know why they tricked them. I do know my.
She scribbled some chicken scratch that she can't read now. Gracie.
I don't know if this is what she meant, but what I've been thinking is they tricked them into thinking they were from far off so that the Hebrews people wouldn't realize that they were part of these people that they were getting ready to attack. So by taking themselves right out of that picture of that whole plan, then they'd have the protection of the Israelites.
Good insight.
Now I know. I gotta talk real fast, man. Like ding ding to my ear. I'm just gonna start all over again. Oh Lord, help me. Okay. It's gone again.
Oh my God.
She lost it again.
Oh, I know what. Wait a minute. Three strikes, I'm out. I only have two
coming.
strikes. Listen. They tricked them, that's for sure.
Uh-oh.
Oh my goodness. That's hilarious.
Oh, I know. Wait.
You
They tricked them, that's the fourth one.
You think about that for a moment.
No, I can't think. That's the problem.
I know. I'm going to let Keith talk for a second and he'll spur your memory.
Okay.
Well, I look at it this way. Being the human beings we are, we overthink things. And then we think, well, I don't know if they'll believe that. Maybe if we tell them this, and then, whatever our end goal is, then we come up and fabricate something to get what we want.
Yeah.
And, we overthink things. Instead of just going right up front and saying what we want, we're thinking, well, they will reject that. So we better try something different.
And I think that's a good point, Keith. And we oftentimes resort to not exactly telling the truth because we're afraid that the truth is not going to get us what we want.
Right.
That's the hard thing is, you never know what God will do if you just had faith in him and actually spoke the truth. But I think that you're right, Keith, in that in a certain sense, he's like, I see where your heart's at. You really are wanting to do the right thing, but you went about it completely the wrong way. Jerry?
I think as believers, we sometimes mix up Genesis, which is before Exodus, and then after the law was given. Like Tamar, and Judah, they were not under the law. We had the Ten Commandments, all they hadn't been given at that time. So they were under what I would call man-made law.
Noahide law.
Well, we don't even know a high law.
Yeah, well, that's a good point, and some people do believe that. I mean, there are a lot of people who believe that the Torah has always been in effect. I mean, obviously that the word of the Lord, the word of the Lord is forever. It had, and I believe that personally, that the word of Yehovah had not been codified. It had not been written down. But it seems clear to me from looking at passages like in Genesis chapter 13, I believe it says that Abraham loved God, and he was talking to his son Isaac and saying, your father kept my Torah, which is a little weird because the Torah didn't come until 450 years later. But I have always likened it to like this. If I am a teacher and I'm teaching just a couple of students, I can keep the rules very basic. But once I get to a larger group, I need to expand those rules, and they need to be written down, and everybody needs to be aware of them. And believe me, being a teacher like some of us are here, you know that the rules expand when there are more children involved. It's much easier to control a small group of people. So I have likened it to that, so that when Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and those guys, they had a relationship with God and they understood His Torah with very basic concepts. But when the Hebrews come along and they're a nation of 2-3 million people, you have to codify it. You got to write it down. You got to publish it so that everybody knows it. It's just something that happens when you have to deal with a much bigger group of people.
A little more like now Enoch. If we can believe the book of Enoch, before he was taken to heaven, he was writing books.
Mm-hmm.
He wanted these books finished to get to his father Methuselah before he was taken. So everything that he wrote down, Methuselah had, I would suspect he gave to Noah. And Noah probably brought it to this side on the ark. And I don't know if Noah and Abraham knew each other, but Shem and Abraham definitely knew each other.
Yeah.
So technically everything they had before the flood, they had after.
I agree.
Had access to it.
I agree.
I think.
And there was
I don't know. This is just supplication, but.
Yeah. No, I agree. June?
Yeah, they were tricked. Joshua and them were tricked because Joshua did not ask God whether these people were genuine or not. And any time that they would go to battle or do certain things, they always prayed and asked God, should we go do this? Should we do that? And that's exactly why they were tricked.
Okay, that's a great observation. And I want to ask you a question, anybody who wants to answer this question. The Bible does, in that passage in the middle of chapter 9, say that it is because the Israelites failed to inquire at the mouth of YHVH regarding the Gibeonites that this problem happened. However, I want you to imagine in your mind for a moment, what if they had asked YHVH? What would have happened if the Gibeonites had been destroyed? The Gibeonites had a fairly significant impact later on in the scripture. The whole nation got cursed because King Saul slaughtered a bunch of Gibeonites. Also, like I said a moment ago, the Gibeonites sent a portion of their tribe back with Nehemiah to rebuild a temple. So, I wonder, what would God have said if they had asked him, hey, these people have come from a faraway place. Is this true? Should we trust them? I wonder what God would have said. Because those people were obviously a part of the story.
Did God have David wipe them out?
No.
Okay.
God had David avenge them.
So then, most likely, God would have probably had some other pathway for them to not be destroyed.
It makes sense to me in my mind that if they had asked God, that God would have said to them, these people are trying to trick you, but I do not want you to destroy them. Perhaps, because they play a fairly significant role in the history of Israel.
Or like when he told them in the first place, you go in there and destroy everybody. Would he change his mind and say, go destroy them, and now don't?
That is a great question, and you know what? You can definitely say that God does not change His mind, and yet He does occasionally. I mean, the Lord never changes. I don't think necessarily that means that the Lord will never change His mind regarding a certain situation. Overall principles, who He is as a God never changes. But Him, Hezekiah is going to die. Who decrees that people die? God does. But Hezekiah turns his face to the wall and cries and says, all right, I'm going to give you an additional 15 years. God does have, and I think that when you see God changing His mind, it is in regards to mercy and grace. He's willing to extend mercy and grace, whereas before He might have had judgment in mind. And that, I think, is applicable perfectly to this situation with the Gibeonites. He might have repented himself and allowed these Gibeonites to live, perhaps.
But he wanted all the people, basically, when he told them to go to each town and destroy them all, he wanted them all destroyed, all the kids and everybody, so
That's
the
right.
generation won't keep coming back to false gods.
That's right.
And wrecking the rest of the people.
Yeah, He definitely wanted these people destroyed. And I think, when you see all of the other people, there's one thing they all have in common. They're ready to fight. And they do fight. They're stiff-necked. They're ready to fight. And I think that is the thing that characterizes all of these people. And that is the thing that characterizes them spiritually. They have no interest in God. They're fiercely rebellious against God, and they are willing to fight God and His people. these people, the heart of these Gibeonites was different. For whatever reason, they decided, we don't want to fight this God. He is God. We see what He is doing with His people, and He will destroy us. We are going to die. We do not want to die. Can you save your life by purchasing fire insurance? Yes, you can.
And the father probably approached them. I mean, if just guessing, the father probably told them, "Hey, do this."
You never know.
Probably showed up and, "Hey, do this."
It's certainly possible. So that's all I have for you, ladies and gentlemen. It is time for Carla to tell us what's on her mind.
Just an observation that we don't know, of course, but perhaps what God says isn't always what He's thinking. Because perhaps He didn't change His mind. He always knew what the outcome would be. He just was going to give limited information to who He was talking to, and later show a different outcome.
I think that's a good insight. I think that God gives you the information you need and not much more. Unfortunately, in a lot of cases, He doesn't give you as much information as you'd like. Any final thoughts for the good of the order? I appreciate you all being here.